right, we are honored to have you here, the young leaders that are leading the future. Wemimo, I want to start with you. What are some of the main obstacles that young entrepreneurs and young founders face, especially in Latin America and globally?
Well, thanks a lot for having me here today, and good morning, everyone. It's such a delight to be here. I think that's a fantastic question, but before I do that, I always like to go down memory lane a little bit because it informs particularly that question. So for me, I grew up in the slums of Lagos, Nigeria, lost my dad at the age of 2, and I was raised by my mother and 2 very spirited sisters. And one thing my mother fundamentally believed in was just the importance of education. She afforded my school fees with 60% of her salary, and that's essentially what led me to transition from Nigeria to the United States. Immigrated from 80-degree weather in Lagos to negative 22 degrees in Minnesota, which was a character-building experience. And during that transition, something important happened. My mother and I did not have a credit score. We walked into one of the biggest financial institutions to borrow money, and were turned away and had to go borrow money from a predatory lender at over 400% interest rate. My mother sold my dad's wedding ring, we borrowed money from church members, and that's how we got started in the United States. So really inspired by that experience, that's what led us to start the company, built on a very fundamental premise that no matter where you come from, the color of your skin and your financial identity shouldn't determine where you end up in life. You know, when I think about some of the challenges that young entrepreneurs sort of face, particularly in Latin America and globally, because I have a global perspective from Africa to the United States, number one is access to funding. You know, when we started Esusu, we spoke to 326 investors, and we got a lot of no's. People were saying the kind of challenges we're addressing wasn't quite ripe for funding. But today, that company is now valued at $1 billion, seeing over $110 billion in rent volume across the United States and growing. Number 2 is access to infrastructure, particularly in a place like Latin America. When you think about internet services, when you think about making sure we have the right regulatory frameworks in place, we need to bring a collective together to make sure we're trying as much as possible to level the playing field for young entrepreneurs. And the last thing I would sort of highlight, my third point, is just trying as much as possible to get access to concentrated information. You know, in the United States, to do what we do, from a regulatory perspective, we need to sort of abide by 4,200 rules and regulations. I wonder what that is in Latin America, and I know it's definitely complex in places like the African continent. So for me, access to capital, the regulatory framework, and then infrastructure is very, very key.
And thank you, Wemimo, for sharing your personal story of resiliency. I think all of you have just such a unique personal story, and one lesson for young people is also bring that to the forefront and let that inform the way you lead.
Absolutely.
Wenyi, on to you now. You moved here to Latin America, to Colombia specifically, not even knowing the language, and you were faced with sort of this middle-class trap, as you like to refer to it. So when we talk about the obstacles that young entrepreneurs face in Latin America, tell us about that stagnant middle class and that middle class trap that you try to overcome with Polymath.
Thank you. So in Latin America, we talk about, you know, it's over 600 million population, and over 300 million of that is in the emerging middle class. And that is both a great challenge and a great opportunity, right? So the challenge being Latin America reached middle income status the earliest out of all the developing regions. But it has stagnated there for many decades for many different reasons. I usually focus on, when I talk about the middle income trap, particularly the productivity of the workers. So to put things in context, populous countries in Latin America like Brazil, like Mexico, they have over 50% of population working informally, right? Africa, similar, maybe even higher numbers. And even more, you know, working in micro and small businesses. Those micro and small businesses, that productivity actually over the last 2 decades before the pandemic was decreasing rather than increasing. So at the end, the productivity gains, even though the countries are growing, the productivity gains was not being driven to a lot of the population, a lot of the businesses, and that the income was not increasing for this population. So that's really the middle income trap at a country level and kind of thinking about the wide population. I think where the big opportunity is digital really changes things, right? So when we build digital platforms, whether in auto repair and direct sales and so forth, we are increasing the take-home incomes of these micro and small businesses by 4, 5, 6, 7 times. It's not a 10, 20, 30% increase. And that is transformative. And I think that that really speaks to how much potential is in the region if you really go and design well-tailored solutions to really bring that entrepreneurial energy and give the funding, the platforms, the know-how, and the tools to access bigger markets than just that neighborhood that they live in.
So technology is really, really making the difference right now, and especially the convergence of these very transformative, innovative technologies as well.
Exactly. I think it's always about technology, but also the application of technology, and that's where kind of the young leaders, particularly in the region, have a lot to do. And we'll talk more about that.
Gabriela, I want to take it to you now, because a big part of this middle income trap, so to speak, and even the dwindling middle class in Latin America, is the gender pay gap, and is the fact that you have numbers still in the region, like for example, the number of women entrepreneurs is 27% in the year 2024. So tell us about, what are the most significant obstacles for women to pursue entrepreneurship in our region?
Yeah, thank you so much, Mariana, for that question. I'm super happy to be here. I think it's important to put that question into context. So for the past 10 or 20 years, a huge focus of the gender agenda has been to get more women into the workforce, among many other things that we've been working on. And there have been significant advances. And the way we did that was we empowered women. We told women to sort of lean in. Women have been upskilling, including in tech, at historic rates. And we saw some gains. So today, for example, in computer science programs, women represent almost half of students. We've almost closed on a global level the educational attainment gap, almost, between women and men. And even in the tech sector, among junior roles, you see women there. The problem is when you look at actually what we tried to move, which was the labor force participation of women, it's changed almost zero.
So we're students, and we just get to that point.
Right, and we enter the workforce.
Right.
We enter the workforce, but something's happening that we're not staying there and we're not growing, right? So, and the numbers are the same that they were in the 90s. And there's a lot of things happening. So to answer your question about what are the challenges, it's not that women aren't there because they don't want to be or because they haven't worked hard to be. It's because there are all these systemic challenges that are keeping them from succeeding. So you mentioned the pay gap. Women still earn a fraction of what men earn. Women are promoted at half the rate. This is the first year that in the C-suite we have less women than we had the year prior. So there are multiple challenges. There's no childcare. There's no paid leave. And we're not designing the incentives and society so that women can actually succeed and not have to burn out trying to do everything, trying to have it all. And what's interesting about this is that it's not just a human rights issue. This is an economic issue.
Absolutely.
It's a very important economic issue. We're here and we've barely talked about the issue of women. And I think we need to think about how much, we know there's data and we've seen it. We know that when women succeed, communities thrive. It's estimated that there could be, $20 trillion more dollars of annual GDP if we had more women in the workforce. So we need to align the incentives. My advice in terms of, getting, what will it take for women to thrive? They're doing everything they can to thrive. I think we need to start doing our part.
We need to support them, absolutely.
Yeah.
Professor Witoto, by the way, for Professor Witoto's intervention, I will urge the non-Portuguese speakers to use headphones, please. Honrada de tenerla aquí hoy. We're honored to have you here today, the Executive Director of the Witoto Institute. I'm originally from Venezuela, so you and I, we share with Brazil the Amazon River. This is the longest freshwater river in the world. And yet one of the biggest public health problems faced by indigenous people is access to clean water. What is the solution to this climate crisis and, frankly, a human rights issue? Professor Witoto.
Hari de Kwena. Kwema Mekwe. Nairaio Witoto. Posso falar na minha língua?
I can speak my own language to you if you so wish,
Não posso.
but I cannot talk in my own native language. I've had a huge challenge to get here. I am coming from the state of Amazonas, from the Sem Fronteira tribe, and on the border of Brazil, Peru, and Colombia, the triple frontier between Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. I don't speak English, so communication was rather difficult, and it's an honor for me to come to this territory in Rio de Janeiro, which is an indigenous territory originally. The indigenous questions in Brazil and Latin America and in the world still poses a big challenge to us because the inequalities, social inequalities, economic inequalities imposed upon these people are daunting. These discussions that today we're tackling to face climate change, for example, they go through an economic issue in these great events, for example, and we, as indigenous peoples, are not inserted effectively in these discussions. When we talk about economic matters, the indigenous peoples, indigenous ethnic groups are not part of these processes. We're remembered. People remember us in pictures like this. But if I weren't here, there would be no indigenous representation to bring to you the reality of our people and to face climate change. That the world, you are thinking about these issues. If you don't take into account indigenous ethnic groups, we're doomed to failure because it is us, indigenous women and indigenous youth in the territories, and with the absence of public officials and the public policies directed to ensuring the livelihoods as of these people with fundamental rights like access to water. It's one of the biggest challenges in our territories. We are in a region, the Amazon region, that has the biggest watershed in the world, but the indigenous territories and traditional communities don't have access to drinking water. People don't have proper access to drinking water. It is a universal good, which is essential to the lives of everyone on Earth. We, indigenous groups, are struggling to ensure that our territories won't be ransacked and they won't be looted or pillaged, because there is a policy in this state to withdraw these territories from us, to invade our territories, and it dates back to the very inception of Brazil to try and extinguish indigenous people in Brazil and in Latin America as a whole. It dates back to colonization. We, as a people, indigenous women, for example, we put our lives at risk and our territories at risk to preserve this land, which today in Brazil, it is under our care. 13% of Brazilian territory is under our care, and the 13% that I'm talking about will ensure the conservation and preservation of 89% of the biodiversity that we have on the planet as a whole to face climate change. But we're not taking into account when it comes to public policies. Our organizations do not receive proper climate investments. Our organizations at the forefront are not cared for or taken into account. It's extremely important so that we will face these challenges with a view to reducing inequalities and having greater impacts. We have to look at companies, corporations, and governments, and they have to look at us. They have to look at indigenous communities and peripheral communities and African, Brazilian people, African, Latin American people. It is us with social technologies and ancestral technologies. As David Kopenhauer says, we're still holding on to this land and the skies so that they won't fall over your heads due to lack of care. É por isso que nós gostaríamos
you and your people in the discussion. to be able to come up with the solutions. Can we give her a big round of applause, please? Thank you. Gracias. Obrigada. You are the ones ensuring that these natural resources are preserved, and you need to be helped in doing that. Máximo, when it comes to even convincing businesses to be able to prioritize sustainability efforts, like the ones that Professor Witoto just talked about, what are the challenges there? What have you encountered in your work in Argentina?
I'm working in sustainability and the climate ecological crisis since 15 years, my whole adult life. And I remember when I started studying environmental sciences 15 years ago, we were 4 in the class, only 4. Look in 15 years how the agenda changed, how it grew, like exponentially. Nowadays, in the top 5 topics that are commented, shared, liked in social media in the world, ESG is in the 5 top. And 70% of youth nowadays thinks that the climate ecological crisis is the #1 challenge they will face in their generation. That means that the demand grew. So the business, because of altruism, because of convenience,
They
now
don't have a
care.
choice.
They don't
Yes.
have a choice. They have to do something about this. I think that the main thing that we didn't figure out yet is how to deal with contradictions. For example, we are talking about territories, no? We need lithium to have a cell phone. We need gold. We need, mining, deforestation, all the things that we usually do to have this kind of events or the life that our suits, everything, no? And we still didn't figure out how to stop the devastation of nature and continue. It's not just fixing a couple of things, just being eco-efficient. We know that. So the new generations will have the #1 challenge will be how do we deal with contradictions? How do we put economy and nature in the same page? How do we value nature, and how can we develop without destroying the territory of our friends? That's our territory also, no?
So you would say that it's now become a corporate imperative for many businesses, but there still needs to be that reconciling, so to speak, of these contradictions.
I think the leaders from businesses, me being one also, we have startups, etc. We need to walk more the territory. We can be experts in finance, in any kind of science, in whatever, but if we stay behind the desk, it's very difficult to really connect. All our skills are but exponentially empowered if we also walk the territory.
So talk the talk and walk the walk, as we say,
Exactly.
as we say in the States. Wemimo, on to you. Esusu, your company, helps people build credit scores and gain access to financial services. What would you say are the principles and values of Esusu that can be applied to Latin America and globally?
Absolutely. Some of the key principles, particularly at Esusu, is an African term, really engulfed in what our name stands for, and it's still Ubuntu. It's this idea of collectivism. You know, if you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, we fundamentally need to go together. It's going to take ideas from folks like the professor, bringing a diverse perspective on how we need to protect the environment and fresh water. And for us, when I think about Esusu, when we built the company, it was built on the idea that the rising tide lifts all boats. We need to bring folks from different backgrounds to solve a particular challenging topic. We always ask people to think outside the box, but we don't let people that are outside the box engage to solve the world's pressing challenges. You know, I'll tell you a funny story. You know, when I was 16 years old, I got recruited to go play at Real Zaragoza, and I'm going to go pay homage to the Maracana, the mecca of soccer, or football. And my mother said, if you go to play soccer, you're going to be disowned. You're not my son anymore.
Wow.
And when I went to corporate America and I was working on Wall Street, I told my mother I was going to quit my job. And she said, well, I thought we made it. But it is important because when my company, Esusu, raised a round of financing of over $130 million, and I called my mother up. I'm like, hey, Mom, we just raised $130 million, and the company's valued at $1 billion. You know what my mother said? She called and said, how's the wedding planning coming along? And the reason why that is important is this idea of proximity.
Okay.
Right? We always try as much as possible to also challenge and think about the toughest issues, but we don't have the right people in the room. So diversity, the idea of collectivism, if there's a child in the favelas that can afford to go to school, that child matters to me even if that child is not mine. You know, if there's a child, you know, in the south side of Chicago that can't put a roof over their head, that child matters to me even if that child is not my nephew or my cousin. So it's this fundamental idea that our futures are inextricably tied together. And that's what we stand for at Esusu, and that's what has helped us build a company from $0 to $1 billion.
Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere.
Absolutely.
Wenyi, on to you. When you look at the broader startup and VC landscape, there's obviously a lot of innovation flowing in the region. That is why we're here. What do you think is helping to push innovation forward, and what more can be done when you look at also what is happening at Polymath?
Right, so I think there's a couple of things I would want to address. One is, what is the evolution in the entrepreneurial ecosystem and technology ecosystem over the last decade? And building on Wenyi's point before around connectivity, when I first came to the region, everybody was, the hot term to talk about was tropicalization. How can we take something from the US and bring it to Latin America? And actually, I don't hear a lot of that these days. And I think that's a very positive thing.
Absolutely.
Right? So what I see are entrepreneurs building for the problems that they observe locally. They're much more connected to what is actually happening on the continent, in their home countries, in their communities. And I think that's a much more powerful source of driving somebody not only to the reason for why your company should exist, but that coherence around the entire workforce, how you're connected to your customers, and so forth. So I think we not only have great successes like Nubank, showing the potential of Latin America, but also newer companies that are coming up. There's a company I love called Galgo, and they started because they noticed all the Venezuelan migrants actually in different countries, in Chile and other places, and started doing motorcycle loans for those migrants that were starting to, be in the Rappi and kind of delivery business, and that business has done incredibly well over just the last 4 or 5 years. So I think that those are, and you listen to these entrepreneurs, and I listen to them pitch to me at different stages, but I would say there's a huge trend over the last, 3 to 5 years where people are no longer all about, I think before there was this, the entrepreneurial class was much more connected to the outside than they were connected to the home country and the home environment, and I see it totally different now. I think the other thing I would add is, at the same time that the local entrepreneurs are being more connected to what's happening in Latin America is attracting a lot more attention from the rest of the world. So that's actually an amazing combination, right? Because there are resources from outside that Latin America needs in order to build these transformative scaled businesses. It needs more capital, right, at all stages. It needs know-how. So for example, I'm quite connected to the Chinese entrepreneurial ecosystem and investment ecosystem, and those investors and those companies coming bring know-how, bring a willingness to bet on some risky bets because they've seen how those types of businesses have grown to just enormous sizes in China, and they believe that that potential exists in Latin America.
So the focus is good, and we need to seize the momentum. Gabriela, on to you briefly, because we're running short on time. When you give women not only the hard skills, but also the soft skills to be able to pursue careers and to be able to be entrepreneurs, how do giving them those skills really translate into meaningful employment opportunities for them, what you do at Laboratoria?
Yeah, so for those of you who don't know us, at Laboratoria we identify high potential women from under-resourced backgrounds, from low-income communities. We train them in tech and soft skills, like you mentioned, and then we connect them with the demand for tech roles in the sector. And we've been doing it for 10 years, and I think part of the success of our placement rate, because 80% of our students, 80% of our graduates start jobs in the tech sector, has been the fact that have been a few things. So first of all, we stay very close to the industry to understand their changing needs, because it's a sector that's constantly innovating, constantly changing. We saw last year with AI and with the layoffs, it's completely changed. So we stay very close to companies to make sure that we partner with them to understand their changing needs and adapt our curriculum and innovate our curriculum constantly for that. We also have an innovative learning methodology, so our students learn by doing. We try to emulate as much as possible real-world scenarios in the classroom to move away from traditional education, which actually has not done a very good job. And so there are a few ways we do it, and I think partnerships have been really key for that. We don't do anything in a vacuum. Nothing succeeds. I think that's a point that everyone here has made, and I think it's really important that we think about that now with AI and everything that's changing, how we need to come together to really make a difference so that these groups, these vulnerable groups, can actually succeed for the benefit of society and the economy as a whole.
So we only have 1 minute left. I want to finish with a rapid fire round to get one word in from each one of you. What do you think is one crucial skill that a young entrepreneur needs to thrive in this environment in Latin America and globally? Wemimo, I'll start with you. And Professor Wanda, you get the last word. Una palabra que se necesita para poder triunfar en este momento como joven empresaria indígena. Wemimo, empiezo contigo. We'll go all the way down.
Perseverance, fall down 7 times, get back 8 times. Keep fighting.
Optimism.
Emotional intelligence and courage.
Learning continuously, never stop.
Coletividade.
Collectivity and example.
Connectivity. A big round of applause for our panel, the board of the future, how they are leading with innovation and heart. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to get off stage and exit stage left.